Aggies down 2 with the ball. Got to get it in. Martinez, it's a 3, and he's fouled, and he has it!
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Basketball in the Mountains. I am your host, Tyler King. Thanks everybody for listening to the first 2 episodes. We had Troy Finnegan on earlier this week to talk about Colorado men's basketball after their first Big 12 win of the season, and I looked ahead at the Big 12 title race as well a little bit in that episode earlier in the week. So if you missed that, go check that out. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, but obviously most notably Spotify and Apple. Obviously, all the episodes are available on YouTube, on my YouTube channel as well. So, anybody who's listening, just go rate, follow the podcast if you can, or rate, review, subscribe on YouTube as well. All that stuff is really helpful. And really excited about today's episode. We're going to go back to the Mountain West. We talked Colorado State in the first episode. Now we're going to talk about the Utah State Aggies, who are having another incredible season in Logan. They're on their another coaching change last offseason, but it really hasn't mattered. They're 23-4, second place in the Mountain West, right behind New Mexico. Just been a really fun team to watch for me, not just this season, but the last couple of years. I got to see them in person, obviously against Colorado State the last couple of years, but also in the NCAA tournament last year in Indianapolis when I was there covering the Buffs. So just been a fun program to watch, and no person I'd rather have on to talk about the Aggies is than Patrick Mayhorn of the Aggship. So we're going to bring Patrick on. Thanks for coming on, Patrick. You're the guy that I go to for Utah State coverage. So excited for this conversation here.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm glad that you're up on my coverage. I appreciate that. Seeing that Ian Martinez shot in the intro video, I've seen that shot about 1 million times now. I don't even know, 25, 30 feet away when he hit it. I was under the basket taking pictures. I still don't know I don't know how he did that. I've seen that shot more times than I would even care to recount. I don't know how that went in. I'm still convinced one of these times it's not going to.
Yeah, it's one of those plays. I mean, I kind of had a similar one last year when I was covering the Buffs in Indianapolis. Like I mentioned, KJ Simpson had a game winner against Florida in the first round of the NCAA tournament. It was kind of a similar shot where it bounced on the rim a couple times before going down. That's one of the staples of our podcast here. We do like a specific intro video for each team we like to talk about, because there are a lot of really good teams to talk about in the Mountain Time Zone, as I will continue to do throughout this podcast from the NBA to college. But like I said at the top, Utah State is a program I've really enjoyed watching and following more closely since I moved out to Colorado a couple of years ago. Obviously it's a program that's had a lot of NCAA tournament success in its history, but also recently as well, with plenty of different coaches, dating back to Craig Smith, Ryan Odom, Danny Sprinkle last year, and now Jerrod Calhoun this season. So first question I'll ask you, Patrick, like, has any of this season surprised you at all? Just kind of whether it was the 19-2 start, just kind of the way they were playing early in the season, just being able to keep guys like Ian Martinez and Mason Falslev from the previous season. Just what's been the biggest? Has any of it surprised you, or were you kind of expecting Utah State to continue the play it's had the last couple of years?
Yeah, so my first season out here covering the team was the 2022-23 season, which was Odom's last year. So I covered that team. They went to the NCAA tournament. They overachieved expectations. I covered Danny Sprinkle's only team, and they had an entire new roster. I don't know that anybody was really expecting them to do what they did. And so now I'm covering, Calhoun's first team. And so I kind of expected it, just because it seems like maybe I have brought good luck with me from Columbus. I think I maybe took it away from the Ohio State basketball program I was covering and brought it out here. So I'm not surprised by anything anymore with this program. It seems like, in my experience, they only ever win, and so I'm not really expecting anything else. But it was a little bit of a surprise. I think that expectations around the program were at least locally, a little bit higher this year than they were certainly last year because of, the retention of a couple key players. Mason Falslev being a big one, Ian Martinez being a big one. Also, guys like Carson Templin, who have, he's really, really grown into a major role for the team. Um, Even, Isaac Johnson, who's not played a ton, but is still, an incumbent, a guy who's stuck around, and even a guy like Jackson Smith, who's the last guy on the bench, walk on. I think he's if I remember right, the only walk on the team, but he just got a bunch of praise from Calhoun the other night for his behind the scenes work as a teammate and as a scout team guy and all of that stuff. And so with keeping those guys around, the hopes for this season definitely rose among the fan base. This is not a fan base that has seen a ton of continuity in recent years, and so there was a lot of excitement about keeping a couple proven players around. It's just not happened a ton at Utah State recently. They've turned over a lot of talent in the last 6-7 years. Um, really since Craig Smith first came in and kind of got it going again in the late 2010s. And so I don't know if the expectations were quite that they would start 19-2 or that they would be 23-4 in mid-February, looking very much like another NCAA tournament bid and still kind of on the outskirts of contending for a Mountain West title. They need some help from New Mexico, or I guess rather the team's playing New Mexico, but um, it's still overachieving, I think, but not quite as much as last season's team did, just because they do at least have players who people know. Last year's team, nobody knew any of any of the guys on the team other than Mason and Isaac, who had both redshirted the year prior.
Yeah, I mean, great. Osibor was a awesome player to watch last season for Danny Sprinkle's team. Obviously, they came together from Montana State. Now are together at Washington, but I mean, there was plenty of big wins for this team early in the season, whether it was the neutral site game against Iowa. You had the back-to-back games against St. Mary's and San Diego State on the road. They won in late December. Were any of those kind of telltale signs early for you that maybe this team was headed toward another overachieving campaign?
Yeah, so I think that 3-game road trip, I don't have, let me see the dates. It was December 22nd through December 31st. That 3-game road swing where they go beat St. Mary's, San Diego State, and Nevada back to back to back on the road. That was really kind of the moment, I think, where I realized what they were working with. I think that was also kind of the moment when the team realized what they were working with, because it's been lost a little bit because nobody outside of the people watching or covering the team would have any reason to know this, but they had lost to UC San Diego the game before at home. This was a big deal. It was, I think, the first loss of the season.
Yeah, it
And
was. Yeah.
like 3 or 4 minutes into that game, Drake Allen, who had been the starting point guard through the first 10 games or so, got a shoulder injury. There was a collision with Hayden Gray, the UC San Diego point guard, great player. And Allen was sidelined for that entire road stretch. And so that moment, it wasn't only Utah State rising to the occasion and winning those road games. It was Utah State doing it without their starting point guard, and really it kind of forced some of the guys, some of the newcomers who had not really gotten it going yet, to step up. That was where Dayton Albury, who is the starting point guard now, that was where he really got his footing. Tucker Anderson, who's coming off the bench at small forward, he got his footing there. He was really, really important in the San Diego State game, especially. He hit the game winner in that game. And those guys have both, but they had been quiet through the first month and a half of the season. And I think that Allen's injury and his absence really kind of made them step up. There was not really another choice. It wasn't like they could just turn to somebody else. And that has really kind of carried through for the rest of the season. That at that point in the year, it had been mostly Ian Mason and Carson Templin were the guys really scoring, were the guys really doing damage. They had not gotten a ton from this class of newcomers. They've got several transfers. They've got a couple freshmen. They just hadn't seen a ton from those guys. There had been moments, but I think that was the spot in the season where the team kind of realized what they could be. And I think where everybody watching also came to the same conclusion of like, okay, this team's losing. This team's without their starting point guard and just won 3 very, very important, very impressive road games. that would all rank as some of the best road wins for like last season's team. And they got them in back-to-back games. That was very, very impressive.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about Jerrod Calhoun specifically, just because he's such a unique, I think, character in college basketball. I was just curious, like, what was the fan base's reaction to his hiring last offseason? He's an Ohio guy, spent the last chunky years at Youngstown State. I mean, he played at Cleveland State in his playing days, really hasn't left that area, throughout his entire playing, coaching career. And now he's making the jump to a program that has had a lot of turnover, and he's tasked with kind of leading the next era. Just kind of what was the thoughts of his hiring and the expectations, and kind of how is the fan base in Logan just really accepted and wrapped their arms around him as the new guy so quickly?
Yeah, I think that the initial reaction was some combination of who and kind of confusion just generally because it had been assumed for the entirety of the search that the top candidates were in some order like Todd Kowalczyk, who's at Toledo, and I think it's Todd Simon, who's at Bowling Green, who was at UNLV briefly. Those were thought to be the main guys. Those were thought to be the leading contenders. There was even a moment the day where it became known, where it started to leak that Calhoun was going to get the job. Like hours before that came out, people were running with Kowalczyk being the pick. Like it was being reported that he was going to be the pick. And so Calhoun had never really been mentioned. He was not really on my radar. I had a list of 20, 25 names to keep an eye on, and he was not on there. It's just it was not one that people were talking about. But then as people started to dig into his resume a little bit, it started to make more sense. The athletic director here right now is Diana Sabo, who's from Ohio. The women's basketball coach is from Ohio. There have been a lot of Ohio people coming into the program over the last couple of years. That's where Sabo's connections are mostly. And so people started to look into the resume, and they saw, I mean, certainly I saw he won 20 plus games at Youngstown State multiple times. That's very hard to do.
Yeah.
That is not a good program. And he really kind of made something out of nothing there. And so I think people started to come around, and then he came in and gave his introductory press conference, and he said that he thought that Utah State could win a national championship, and that was kind of enough to get everybody on board. People around here don't say that a lot. They just that's not a phrase that comes up. I wrote at the time that like it slowly but surely you've seen the expectations rise just in what coaches promise to do in their introductory press conference, where Danny Sprinkle wanted to win an NCAA tournament game. Ryan Odom wanted to win an NCAA tournament game, contend for the Mountain West. Craig Smith wanted to get the team back to contending for the Mountain West. Like they've slowly been building more and more, and they get the one tournament win last season. And Jerrod Calhoun comes in and says, well, what if we got 5 more? What if we just added 5 more onto that and won a national championship? And I think that was enough to kind of sell everybody here on his vision for the program and his specific flavor as a coach. So people have really rallied around him, and he's become a very popular figure, as you would imagine, in Logan.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at a lot of the teams that have made even the Final Four the last couple of years, I mean, San Diego State made the national championship game a couple years ago, a Mountain West program, obviously the premier Mountain West program, but even Florida Atlantic with Dusty May made the Final Four a couple years ago as like an 8 or a 9 seed. So I guess it isn't outlandish for Utah State, who was an 8 seed last year, to have aspirations of that. But as this season has gone the way it has, is there any concern from the fan base that, oh no, could we be headed toward another one and done kind of situation? Or does it feel like Calhoun could be a guy that could be the long-term solution? I guess it is interesting because of, like we said, this is like the first time in his coaching career that he has made this kind of a journey, and it is a new situation for him. But kind of has he addressed that at all, or just kind of how has the fan base reacted to the lingering concerns maybe of what's to come after another really impressive season?
Yeah, I think that the fan base is going to be understandably concerned until Jerrod Calhoun is on the sidelines coaching the first game of the 2025-26 season. Like there's a lot of hurt here. There's a lot of people who are really, really just not convinced that any coach is ever going to stick around with the amount of turnover that they've had in the last 4 years, basically, where Craig Smith goes to Utah after 3 years, Ryan Odom goes to VCU after 2 years, Danny Sprinkle goes to Washington after 1 year. People are going to have to see it to believe it. I am not of the opinion that he's going anywhere. I don't think that I think that there are probably 2 jobs in the country that he would be legitimately very interested in and that he might think about leaving for, and that would be Cincinnati and West Virginia. Those are the 2 schools that he has the strongest ties to, that he has a background with. He was an assistant for both. West Virginia, particularly, he spent 5 or 6 years as an assistant under Huggins there. He was an assistant on the Final Four team, and just has a lot of ties to the school. But as long as that doesn't happen, I think Utah State is in the clear for this year. He's an extremely good fundraiser, and he has raised a lot of funds to try and bolster the program before jumping to the new Pac-12 or Pac-8 or whatever we're calling it. And he's put a lot of time into trying to build out the program for the future. They've got the best high school recruiting class in program history coming in. That's by like a wide margin. It's not really even. It's the best class, and there's not really a second one that's within striking distance. It is as good as it has ever been for Utah State on that front. And I just, I guess that doesn't really mean anything now, because if you go to a different school, you can just grab those guys and take them all along with you. And if they can't come, you can just sue the NCAA, and then they'll be there in 2 months. But I don't think he's going to go anywhere. I think that he's serious when he says that he wants to be at Utah State long term. He's said that a lot. He has not signed an extension yet. I think that they are trying to get that done. I don't know what the holdup is on that, but I would be surprised if he leaves after 1 year. I was also, I would have been surprised if you said that Danny Sprinkle was going to leave after 1 year until about February of last year, where it started to become pretty apparent that was what he was going to do. But at this time last year, I was pretty sure Danny Sprinkle was going to leave. At this time this year, I don't think Jerrod Calhoun's going anywhere.
Yeah, I think we could be headed toward like a situation where, with the team I cover, one of the teams I cover most heavily, Colorado State, has with Nico Medved, where I think what you mentioned about Jerrod is there's 2 pretty clear jobs he would be interested in Cincinnati and West Virginia. Obviously, West Virginia has Darian DeVries, who's in his first year there, having a solid year. Cincinnati has Wes Miller, who's a couple years in there, but doesn't seem like he's on the hot seat right now.
Big buyout is helping Utah State out there. I think that's like $10 million.
Yeah, and same thing for CSU with Nico Medved, who's made the NCAA tournament twice in the last 3 seasons. Would have been an NCAA tournament team this year if they had a better non-conference schedule. They could be a bid stealer in the Mountain West tournament, but that's a little bit unlikely. But it just feels like it's a little bit of a surprise maybe that Nico is still here, but there's one job I feel like he would take no matter what. That's the Minnesota job, where he was, that's where he was a student assistant. That's where he went to school. That's where he's from. Like, he has so many ties there. And he was obviously a candidate for the West Virginia job last year, the Washington job last year, but he's enjoying CSU. He was an assistant here under Tim Miles, so it's a second stint in Fort Collins. So I think Utah State could be headed toward a similar situation with Jerrod Calhoun, where you feel like you've got this guy, barring 1 or 2 big jobs, important jobs to him, coming open. So that could be the best thing for the program. And I think the most impressive thing about me that really raised my eyebrows in the offseason was just the ability to keep Ian Martinez and Mason Falslev around. Mm-hmm. Like, Ian Martinez, obviously a guy who began his career at Utah, then went to Maryland before coming back to Utah to play for the Aggies before last season. Mason Falslev is a Utah State guy. He's from the area, but were you surprised at all that those guys stuck around, or maybe not as much for Mason, but for Ian in particular? Like, how was that a similar thing for you, where you're like, oh, okay, maybe this is a little bit different, that they're able to keeping, especially these 2, really, really, really good players around?
Yeah, it was it was a little bit of a surprise. I know that they have made, like, even just last spring when Calhoun was coming in, they had already started to make a lot of strides on the NIL front. They had already started to really bolster those coffers in the way that they needed to, and obviously they had enough to get it done for those 2 guys, and that was not easy. I mean, those players did not come cheap, because they're very good players, and a lot of schools wanted them. For Mason specifically, It is, I think, harder than people realize to keep a guy like that around because you have old money bags down there in Provo, pretty much willing to tamper with any player that Utah State has with any ties to Utah. I don't think I'm telling tales out of school here. BYU will tell you that it does that. Like, BYU is pretty open on Front Street about their interests in spending some money on basketball players. But that took some doing. Mason is a local kid. He's from 5-10 miles away, and I think that played in Utah State's favor quite a bit. They have given him the legacy pitch a lot, and I think that's something that has a lot of sway with him. Is he grew up going to Utah State games. Like, he grew up watching J.C. Carroll play, and J.C. Carroll had his jersey retired while Mason was on the team. Mason was here in 2022 and was there for that event, and like, that's a player who he grew up idolizing and cheering for. And I think that he has similar aspirations. I think that he would love to be the next guy to be the next guy, basically, at Utah State, the guy who has his jersey going up in the rafters. And so they had that going for them, and will presumably have that going for them again this upcoming offseason, because they will have to keep everybody at bay again. That's life in college basketball, I suppose, at this point. But Ian was the one that was really impressive, because Ian has no real connections to the program beyond just that he was here last year. He's from Costa Rica. He played his first year of college basketball at Utah, and his connection was to, I think, Andy Hill, who was on the last staff and is now at Washington. That was the coach who he was familiar with, and why he kind of came to Utah State. And he had plenty of suitors. I mean, he's averaging 17 points a game in the Mountain West. That's the kind of player who's going to have suitors. And Utah State got the money together that they needed to keep him around. I thought that was very impressive, the way that they did that, the way that Calhoun kind of, I mean, he really got people on board. Like, it kind of made it apparent that it was not negotiable, that if they wanted to keep Ian Martinez around, if people wanted to continue watching Ian Martinez play, they were going to need the money to get that done. And they got it. I mean, it's lost to time now, and it doesn't really matter because they didn't end up doing it, but they were a lot closer on keeping Great Osobor than people realize. A lot closer. They did not have anywhere near as competitive an offer to him as the Kentuckys and the Washingtons of the world. And ultimately, when Washington comes in with $2 million, that's a little bit tough to get over. But they made it a fight. They made it a serious fight through the end. And I mean, I was even impressed by that. Like, even losing a guy of that caliber, big men are hard to keep around. It is really, really hard to get good big men in college basketball. And that they made him think about it that much, I thought was very impressive in its own right, even if it wasn't quite on the same level as keeping guys like Ian and Mason around.
Yeah, I want to transition a little bit to kind of the stretch they have coming up here. There's 4 games left in the regular season here for the Aggies. 3 tough games, and then they close with Air Force at home, which Air Force is just, as somebody who lives in Colorado, Air Force is just really one of the toughest jobs in the country right now. A big reason why I wanted to have you on is because of the San Diego State game tomorrow night in Logan. We mentioned earlier, obviously, during that 3-game road win streak, that San Diego State was a part of that. They were ranked at the time. That was a 1-point win. But there's that game tomorrow night, and then they're at Boise State and at Colorado State. I'll be at that game next Saturday at Moby Arena. So 3 really tough games against some Mountain West contenders. Obviously, Utah State's only really lost to New Mexico and UNLV once in Mountain West play. So what are kind of the feelings heading into this last stretch? Like, Ian Martinez has played really well. I think Mason Falslev has had an incredible month of February. Like, when I watched him play against CSU earlier this season, what he does on both ends of the floor is just unheard of. Like, he is a really, really outstanding player. And then you mentioned some of the other guys that have been coming on too. Like, I've been really impressed with Carson Templin, like the stuff that he's been able to do. Dexter Akano, like, I think there are a lot of really good players on this roster that you can feel good about, going forward past the regular season, looking at the postseason. But specifically with this 3-game stretch coming up here, like, how important is it, and kind of what are you expecting out of this stretch here?
Yeah, I mean, it's crucial. They if they want any real chance of staying alive in the Mountain West title race, they have to win out. They can't there's not enough room at this point in the season for them to lose games if they want to be able to get that done in the regular season and contend. I mean, if they want the 1 seed, they need a lot of help and they need to win out. But either way, these are very important games. These are games that have meaning beyond the stakes of the season. You know, these are rivalry games. I would say all 3 of these are rivalry games for Utah State.
Yeah.
To at least some degree. And these are teams that Utah State cares about beating. These are teams that Utah State cares about playing against, and they're important for that as well. I think that the expectations right now, the outlook is generally pretty positive. I think people feel pretty good about where the team is at. I mean, they're coming off of, what was that, a 48-point win over San Jose State, and so
It was a lot. Yeah.
Generally, you're going to be feeling pretty good after beating San Jose State by 48 points. Poor San Jose State. That's like the 3rd time that Utah State has beaten San Jose State by 40 plus points in a Mountain West Conference game. It's the only team that they've done it to. They just, every couple of years, they explode on poor San Jose State. But I think people feel pretty good about where the team is at. They played really well at New Mexico. They didn't do enough to get it done, but they played really well in that game. I thought they played really well against Colorado State a couple weeks ago. That was a very good game. I thought, I was impressed that Colorado State stayed alive, given how well Utah State was playing, and that they didn't fall out of the game entirely. Because it looked like Utah State was going to run away with it there for a little while. But they've been playing pretty well really since that first loss to New Mexico back in the Spectrum on February 1st. Mason has really gotten it going, which I think is a big part of it. He was slumping for the better part of a month, just couldn't hit shots. It started at the free throw line. He had some yips at the free throw line, and it just extended to the rest of his game. I'm of the belief that there is a correlation between his return to form and his decision to start wearing calf sleeves for every game, which he was not doing at any point before in the season. I think that maybe sometimes the brain with college basketball players is a little bit strange, and you just change one thing and that fixes you. And I think maybe it it maybe did legitimately have an impact on him, just doing something a little bit different and getting a different feel there, because he's been excellent for the last 3 or 4 games after really struggling in January. Ian has been consistently very good. They just played their first really good game on defense in about 2 or 3 weeks against San Jose State. I mean, they were aces. That's a competent team. Like, that's a San Jose State team that can score point. They put 14 threes on Utah State in the first matchup, and Utah State just shut them down this time. So I think that they are rounding into form at the right time. They're getting good contributions from guys who aren't the usual stars. Drake Allen has been, I mean, just about perfect for 2 months now. He's done everything that they've asked him to do. You mentioned Dexter Akano. Carson Templin's a rebounding machine. Dayton Albury does 2 or 3 just completely ridiculous things every game, like things you've never seen on a basketball court. He just does routinely. And so I think that they're looking pretty good. I don't know if I would predict that they're going to win all 3 of those games, because that's a tough stretch. I think that if I had to guess, the most likely loss is probably at Colorado State. I don't love that matchup for Utah State. I think that, I mean, I don't really love the matchup against Nick Clifford for anybody. That's a hard matchup. He's a problem in his own right, and I don't know that Utah State really has a great solution for him, because they just don't have that size on the wing that you would need to keep up with him. But I think that they can and clearly have beaten, San Diego State. They have the ability to do it. I don't love this San Diego State team. I think that they're playing better right now than they have for most of the season, but I still think that I would give Utah State the edge. And then Boise, I'll believe it when I see it with Boise. I see the highs, and then I also see the lows. I would like to see a little bit of consistency from Boise before I go and predict them to win a game like that, even if it is at home. And so I think Utah State would be happy to get 2 of 3. I would guess that Utah State probably does get 2 of 3 and then drops that Colorado State game and bounces back with a senior day win against Air Force.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you said. I would expect them to go 2-1, and that, I mean, obviously Boise State beats New Mexico the other night. That was kind of a big result, and I've seen the highs and the lows in one game when I saw them in person against CSU earlier this season. They got down by like 20, and Tyson Degenhart just kind of, and Alvaro Cardenas as well, just kind of wills them back into that game, and it was a 1-point game, and CSU needed kind of a game winner to to win it late, but I still kind of
team.
feel the same. Yeah, just a really weird team. Like I still don't think Leon Rice has figured out the rotation. He called that game after CSU rock bottom. Like it was just that they've had a weird season overall after coming in as the preseason favorites of the conference.
Yeah.
I still think New Mexico is a little bit head and shoulders above everybody else in the conference, just with the Donovan Dent and Nelly Jr. Joseph tandem. I don't know if anybody has anything to combat that, but I do think Utah State is the second best team, and then there's on their day either CSU, Boise, or San Diego State can be the third best team, because I also agree with you that this isn't the same San Diego State we've seen in the last couple of years. I just simply think they're lacking some of the NBA talent they've had the last couple of years, and the stars from that the NCAA tournament run to the championship game are all gone. Miles Bird is a really good player, but and Magoon Guath is a really intriguing big guy for them, but I just don't think they have the same. It's all about defense for them. If they can muck up a game enough, they can beat anybody in the conference, but I don't know if they have the high end talent to keep up with some of the bigger teams on a neutral floor, or just a game that's not at Viejas, frankly.
Yeah.
Just kind of heading into the Mountain West tournament in a couple weeks. Like, do you feel like Utah State can win it? Or I mean, I feel like it's silly to say they couldn't, but or do you feel like it is New Mexico's tournament to lose at this point?
Yeah, I would say it's probably New Mexico's to lose. I think Utah State certainly can. I think really any of the top 5 can. I mean, if San Jose State got really hot from 3, they could do some damage too. Like that's a scary team if they're hitting threes. There aren't a ton of teams in this conference that I'm not like a little afraid of at the least. Like, there's pretty much everybody has at least something that they can do pretty well, even if it's just like Fresno State having a bunch of weirdly good young players. I don't know how they got those guys. But I think it's probably New Mexico's to lose. I think that they deserve that sort of respect for the season that they've had. I mean, they have the best point guard in the Mountain West, and they have the best center in the Mountain West, and that's going to take you a pretty long way when you have those two things. That makes basketball pretty easy when you do that. It makes it pretty easy for the rest of the guys on your floor. And they've leaned into that, and it's been very good for them. I would expect that they will win the league championship, probably regular season and postseason. But once you get into Vegas, pretty much anything can happen. And I think that Utah State's matchup zone defense is probably going to cause some problems in that format, because it is, it's a lot easier to prepare for on 2-day prep than it is on half a night prep, which is kind of what you get in the Mountain West tournament. It's not like these teams haven't seen it before, but it is a little bit of a different beast. And I mean, yeah, like you said, I think any of the top 5 have the ability, if they get going. If Nick Clifford goes nuts for Colorado State, I think that they could win it. Boise State probably would have to be the Cardenas and Degenhart show, like it has been all year. San Diego State, the way I've been talking about them this year is that the guys on that team who look most like San Diego State players when they play, the guys who feel the most like Dutcher players, are the youngest guys on the team. It's the freshmen and the sophomores. I love that freshman class. I think that freshman class is going to be phenomenal for them. And then like Guath, I think it's fantastic. And those are the guys who have San Diego State body types, where they're just really, really long and strong, and they look like superheroes a little bit. And then you have a little bit of a lull between them and the upperclassmen. I think a lot of the upperclassmen they just don't quite have that same physicality to them that you come to expect from San Diego State. I think they probably missed at least a little bit on a couple transfers. I'm not a huge Miles Bird guy. He doesn't make a ton of sense for me there with that program, because they're all about consistency, and I wouldn't describe Miles Bird as the most consistent player in the world. Talented, very talented, but maybe not the most consistent. And so it's been a little bit weird. It's been a little bit mismatched for them this season, but they certainly have all kinds of talent. And I mean, Dutcher's one of the best coaches in the country. I would be foolish to bet against Dutcher more than absolutely necessary. But I really think any of the 5 could do it. I would probably pick New Mexico because of the stability provided by those stars. But I think all 5 have a path that it's not that hard to see for any of them.
All right, well, I'll wrap up here with you, Patrick, by talking a little bit about Utah State's NCAA tournament resume. Right now on ESPN, I think they are projected as in 9 seed. against UConn, which would be a fascinating matchup for the Aggies. But obviously they were in the 8-9 game last season, beat TCU before losing to Purdue. I actually that was one of the upsets I was keen on. I thought that might happen just with the Osibor Zach Edey matchup of it all. That was one I got to watch in person and was excited to watch in person in Indy. But for you, what is the NCAA tournament ceiling for this team? Not necessarily seed wise, but just how far they could go. Do you feel like it is a similar to last season, or is it just kind of about finding the right matchup at that point in March, which it honestly is for a lot of teams?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a matchup thing. They're kind of like what I was just talking about with the Mountain West tournament, but really even more so in the NCAA tournament because you don't have the same familiarity. Their defense is going to cause problems for people in the NCAA tournament. If they win a game in the NCAA tournament, that second round matchup becomes that much easier because you've got 1 day prep, and that's a hard defense to prep for on 1 day prep. It'll be matchups. I mean, if they go and get an 8 or a 9 seed, I don't love their chances to get to the second weekend because that's just that's never not going to be a brutal draw. Even if you get the most favorable of the 1 seeds, it's still a 1 seed. It's still, Florida or Duke or whoever, a team that's much better than you, essentially, no matter what. And so I think that their ceiling in the NCAA tournament is probably going to depend on if they can basically win out and get to a 7 or a 6 seed. 7, I think, is probably the best that they could do because I don't think that they're going to win out. But if they do, maybe they could try to push for a 6. If they win these last 4 games and win the Mountain West tournament, you'd have a pretty serious case at that point. You'd be 30, 31-4, whatever it would be. That's pretty good. You could live with that. But I think that they need to do that. I don't really know that they would have a path as an 8 or 9. Honestly, I think it would be better to be a 10 at that point than to be an 8 or 9 because they've seen what that life is like having to play a 1 seed in the second round, and it's just a different beast, and it requires more talent than Utah State has, I think. But Utah State does have the kind of cohesion as a team, the coaching, the scheme, all of that stuff to spring an upset on a team that's not so far ahead talent-wise, that doesn't have a Zach Edey or anything like that. A 2 seed, a 3 seed. If they get the right draw, I think that they could be a second weekend team. I don't know that they'd be much farther than a Sweet 16 team at absolute best, and it would depend again on those first 2 rounds and who they draw. But that'd be pretty good. I mean, they've not gone to the Sweet 16 since it's been called the Sweet 16. They did it back in the 60s, but it's been a minute. That would be a pretty good debut season for Jerrod Calhoun. A lot has to go right, though. They have to get a lot of good draws for that to happen. They have to get a team probably that doesn't really have a great zone offense. They certainly need to avoid any truly dominant centers because they just don't have the guys to handle that. The center room does not provide enough rim protection for them to deal with that. But it could be done. I think that they could get 2 wins in the NCAA tournament, the best case scenario. I don't think they could get more than that, but I think people would be very happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you as well. I think, right matchup comes along, they definitely could be a Sweet 16 team. Like I said, I thought there was a chance last year they could have taken it to Purdue, but I think Purdue even surprised me a little bit with how good they were in the NCAA tournament. Like I still am not really a Zach Edey guy. I never was throughout his Purdue tenure. Just as a Penn State guy, I was just always a little bit dubious of Edey, but he proved me wrong in getting to the national title game. But all right, this was a great conversation. Like I said at the top, Utah State's a program I really enjoyed watching the last couple of years, even with new coaches, different play styles. There's always a lot of talent in Logan. The teams have been fun to watch, and it's a team that I'll be monitoring as the Mountain West tournament approaches, and then in the NCAA tournament as well. Maybe there's a chance they could come to Denver, where I'll be covering the first round, first weekend. So, Patrick, thanks for being one of the first guests here on Basketball in the Mountains. Yeah, we'll be talking a lot about Utah State as this podcast moves forward. So, thanks again, man.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, so that'll do it. Thanks again to Patrick. You can follow him on X at Patrick_Mayhorn. You can follow at the Aggship as well, and read theagship.com for the best coverage of Utah State athletics. Just before I sign off here, just previewing the weekend ahead. I'll be in Boulder tomorrow, on Saturday, covering CU versus Baylor. Colorado State is on the road at UNLV. That's a really interesting matchup. That would be a good road win for CSU as they try to build momentum going forward toward the Mountain West tournament, like we talked about here today. Obviously, the big reason we had today's episode, Utah State versus San Diego State tomorrow night in Logan. And the last game I want to touch on is Arizona versus BYU in Tucson. Arizona's been playing really, really well, beat Baylor on the road earlier this week. And BYU just kicked the crap out of Kansas in Provo earlier this week. So that could be a really fascinating game for two teams that are now Arizona's right near the top, and BYU is now even ahead of Kansas, I think in 5th or 6th place in the Big 12. So that'll be a big game as well. So stay tuned for all my coverage from the weekend. Like I said, I'll be in Boulder tomorrow for Colorado's game against an interesting Baylor team. So like I said at the top, anybody who listens, please go rate, review, subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube if you prefer that. Thanks again to Patrick for coming on, and thanks everybody for listening. We'll be back next week.